The highway stretched out like an endless black ribbon, disappearing into the horizon under a moonless sky. Jake Owens, a seasoned trucker, had driven this route 100 times before, but tonight something felt off. He had picked up a long haul from Nevada to Oregon, carrying a load of construction equipment. The paycheck was good, but the eerie silence of the road gnawed at him. No radio station was coming in clear, and even the chatter on the CB radio was non-existent. It was as if the world had gone quiet, leaving Jake alone in the cab with nothing but the low hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. The vast desert stretched endlessly on either side, barren and lifeless. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:07 a.m., the witching hour. Jake chuckled to himself, but the nervous edge in his laugh betrayed his growing unease. The road was empty, except for the occasional tumbleweeds skittering across the asphalt. Jake had been trucking long enough to have seen his share of strange things out here in the middle of nowhere. Shadows that darted across the highway, figures standing at the edge of the desert, and phantom headlights in the distance that never seemed to get closer. But tonight felt different, like the very air around him was thick with something unseen, something watching. As Jake rounded a bend in the road, his headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the highway. His heart slammed into his chest as he slammed the brakes. The truck's tires screeched against the pavement, coming to a halt just a few feet from the person. Squinting through the windshield, Jake saw it was a woman. She was pale, with long, dark hair matted to her face, wearing a tattered dress that looked out of place in the frigid desert night. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and terrified. Jake rolled down the window, shouting over the roar of the idling engine, "Hey, you all right? Need a ride?" The woman didn't move. She didn't even seem to hear him. Her eyes were fixed on something far beyond him, like she was staring right through him. Then, slowly, her mouth opened. It wasn't a scream. It was a long, guttural wail that seemed to reverberate in Jake's bones. A chill ran down his spine as the woman's voice cut through the stillness of the night like nails on a chalkboard. Without warning, the woman turned and sprinted into the desert, her bare feet kicking up dust as she disappeared into the darkness. Jake's heart raced. What the hell had he just witnessed? He debated for a moment whether to follow her, but something inside him screamed, "No!" Something primal. He put the truck in gear and sped down the highway, eager to put distance between himself and whatever that was. But even as he drove, the image of the woman's lifeless eyes haunted him. 10 miles passed, then 20. He was pushing 80 now, the truck rattling as he pushed it faster than he ever had before. His hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles were white. He had to get to a rest stop, a gas station, anywhere with people. But the road ahead was empty, and the nearest town was still hours away. Suddenly, his headlights flickered. The dash lights blinked, and the engine sputtered before roaring back to life. Jake swore under his breath, his pulse quickening. He glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. There, sitting in the passenger seat, was the woman. Her head was tilted slightly, and her wide, hollow eyes stared directly at him through the mirror. Jake's breath hitched, and he yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck veered off the road, skidding across the desert sand before coming to a jarring stop. He scrambled to unbuckle his seatbelt, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He flung open the door and stumbled out into the cold night air, falling to his knees in the dirt. His heart was pounding in his ears, and his breath came in ragged gasps. When he dared to look back into the cab, the woman was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the cab was still, save for the soft rumble of the engine. Jake stayed there for what felt like hours, his mind racing to comprehend what he had just seen. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. But every fiber of his being screamed that it was. He climbed back into the truck, his hands still trembling. He needed to keep moving. He needed to get away. But as he drove, the truck began to feel smaller, like the walls were closing in on him. The air inside the cab was thick, suffocating. Jake's eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see her again, but there was nothing, just the empty, dark road behind him. After what felt like an eternity, Jake saw the glowing lights of a truck stop in the distance. Relief washed over him, and he floored the gas, desperate to get there. He pulled into the parking lot, the truck coming to a halt with a heavy sigh. He jumped out and rushed inside, his legs unsteady beneath him. The place was nearly deserted, just a tired cashier behind the counter and a couple of other truckers seated in a booth, sipping coffee. Jake headed straight for the restroom, splashing cold water on his face, trying to steady his breathing. When he looked up at the mirror, his blood ran cold. Standing in the doorway behind him, reflected in the mirror, was the woman. Her lifeless eyes locked onto his. Jake spun around, but the doorway was empty. He staggered back, his heart thundering in his chest. He needed to get out of there. Fast. He ran back to the truck, but as he reached for the door handle, something cold touched his hand. He froze, slowly turning his head. The woman was standing next to him, her face inches from his. Her mouth opened again, releasing that same bone-chilling wail, louder this time, deafening. Jake's vision blurred, the sound consuming him, filling his head with an unbearable pressure. The last thing he saw before everything went black was her face, twisted in agony, as she leaned in closer, her cold breath brushing against his skin. When Jake was found the next morning by another trucker, his body was still in the driver's seat. The truck's engine was still running, but Jake's eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of trauma. The only thing out of place was a single handprint on the inside of the passenger window, smeared across the glass as if someone or something had tried to get in. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the highway like a curtain of icy nails. Carl Thompson, a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, squinted through the windshield of his rig, struggling to see the road ahead. His wipers thrashed back and forth, barely keeping up with the deluge. He had picked up a load in Arkansas and was on his way to a small town in Kansas, a route he didn't take often but figured it would be an easy drive. That is, until the storm hit. It had been hours since he last passed another vehicle. The isolation was unsettling. The radio crackled with static, and even the familiar trucker banner on the CB had gone silent, as though the storm had swallowed the world whole. Carl took a deep breath, trying to shake off the nagging sense of dread creeping up his spine. He told himself it was just the weather playing tricks on his nerves. But deep down, he knew better. His truck's headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating only a few feet of road ahead. And then, through the haze, he saw it. A sign. Last stop 10 miles. He hadn't planned on stopping, but after hours in the storm, he was ready for a break. A warm cup of coffee and a few minutes to stretch his legs sounded like heaven. He pressed on, keeping his eyes peeled for the exit. The road narrowed as Carl approached a small, dilapidated gas station. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. The neon sign flickered weakly. Dale's Fuel and Diner. Dale's Fuel and Diner. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in an old horror flick, but Carl was too exhausted to care. He pulled the rig into the lot and parked. The rain pounded the roof of the cab like gunfire as he grabbed his coat and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped into the diner. The place was empty. Not a single soul in sight, not even behind the counter. The lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie yellow glow over the cracked vinyl booths and greasy tables. It smelled of stale coffee and something else. Something sour that Carl couldn't quite place. "Hello?" Carl called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the small space. No response, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights. He walked over to the counter, tapping his fingers on the cracked formica as he waited for someone to appear. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Feeling uneasy, Carl considered heading back to the truck. But as he turned to leave, a figure emerged from the kitchen. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a filthy apron and a cap that barely clung to his thinning hair. He didn't look at Carl right away, instead wiping his hands on a stained rag. "Help ya?" the man asked in a voice that seemed too deep, almost unnatural, like it didn't belong to him. "Just some coffee, if you've got it," Carl replied, trying to hide his discomfort. The man gave a slow nod and disappeared back into the kitchen. Carl sat down at the counter, glancing at the ancient jukebox in the corner. It looked broken, like it hadn't played a song in years. The silence in the diner was oppressive, and Carl could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. A few minutes later, the man returned, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of Carl without a word. Carl took a cautious sip. It was bitter and lukewarm, but he was too tired to care. He just wanted to finish it and get back on the road. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, Carl noticed something strange. There were no other vehicles in the parking lot. No one else had come in since he arrived, and yet the smell of food hung heavy in the air. It was fresh, too fresh. He glanced around the diner, his eyes falling on a door at the back of the room. It was slightly ajar, and behind it, he could see something dark. Curiosity got the better of him. He stood up, walking slowly toward the door, his boots echoing on the worn tile floor. As he approached, the smell grew stronger, more pungent. His stomach churned, but he couldn't stop himself. He pushed the door open a little wider, peeking inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was small, more like a storage closet, and it was filled with hanging slabs of meat. But this wasn't beef or pork. Carl's heart hammered in his chest as his eyes fell on a pair of boots sticking out from one of the slabs. They were human, and worse, they were fresh. Carl stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as he did. He turned to run, but the man from behind the counter was standing right in front of him now, blocking his path. His eyes were dead, soulless, and he smiled, a wide, toothy grin that sent a chill down Carl's spine. "You weren't supposed to see that," the man said, his voice a low growl. Carl bolted for the door, but the man was fast, faster than anyone should have been. He grabbed Carl by the arm, his grip like iron, and dragged him back toward the kitchen. Carl fought, kicking and thrashing, but the man was inhumanly strong. As they reached the kitchen door, Carl saw it, an old butcher's block covered in blood with tools laid out neatly beside it. "Let me go," Carl shouted, panic surging through him. The man didn't respond. He simply hoisted Carl onto the block, holding him down with one massive hand. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to break free, but it was no use. The man reached for a cleaver, raising it high above his head. Just as the blade was about to come down, the sound of a truck horn blared outside. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the diner's entrance. Carl didn't wait. With a burst of adrenaline, he twisted out of the man's grip and ran for the door, not daring to look back. He burst into the rain-soaked night, sprinting toward his truck. The horn was still blaring, but there was no one else around, no other vehicles. He jumped into the cab, slamming the door behind him, and gunned the engine. The tires screeched as he tore out of the parking lot, the diner fading into the distance behind him. Carl didn't stop until he was miles down the highway, his heart still racing, his hands shaking on the wheel. He didn't know what he had stumbled into back there, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever that place was, it wasn't just a diner. And as he drove through the rain, headlights in the rearview mirror flickered into view, getting closer, following him relentless. The cold October night seemed endless as Tom Parker, a seasoned trucker, powered down an empty stretch of Route 89 deep in the mountains of Utah. His 18-wheeler rumbled along the narrow, winding road, cutting through the dense woods that loomed on either side like a wall of shadows. He was used to long nights alone on the road, but tonight felt different. Something gnawed at the back of his mind, an unease he couldn't shake. The weather had taken a turn for the worse in the last hour. Heavy fog now blanketed the road, so thick that Tom could barely see beyond the reach of his headlights. Every bump, every rustle of the trees outside made his heart jump. He turned up the radio, hoping some old rock tune would calm his nerves, but all he got was static. Sighing, he turned it off, leaving him in the oppressive silence of the night, broken only by the low hum of the truck's engine. The clock on his dashboard read 2:42 a.m. Still another 2 hours to go before the next rest stop. Tom's eyelids felt heavy, but the creeping feeling that something wasn't quite right kept him alert. He knew these roads well, but something about tonight made him feel like he was driving into the unknown. The fog swallowed up the world around him, and even though the road was straight ahead, it felt like he was moving deeper into a place he didn't belong. Then, through the swirling fog, Tom saw a figure standing on the side of the road. His heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt with a screech that echoed through the trees. For a moment, everything was still. The figure stood just beyond the reach of his headlights. A woman. She was wearing a long white dress, her hair tangled and wet as if she had just stepped out of a river. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him. Tom's pulse quickened. He rolled down the window, his voice barely steady. You okay? You need help? The woman didn't answer. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes seemed to shimmer in the gloom. Tom's skin crawled. He had heard stories from other truckers, tales of ghostly hitchhikers, women in white, all kinds of creepy legends that haunted lonely roads like this. But he didn't believe in that stuff. This was just some poor woman stranded in the middle of nowhere. He couldn't just leave her out here. Cautiously, he opened the door and stepped down from the cab. The air outside was biting cold, the fog thick and wet against his skin. As he approached the woman, something about her seemed off. She stood too still, too rigid, like she wasn't quite real. But he pushed the thought away. You lost? My truck's warm. If you need a ride, I can take you to the next town, he said, his voice sounding strange in the dense fog. Slowly, the woman turned her head to look at him. Her eyes, now fully visible in the dim light, were dark and hollow, like two deep voids that sucked in the light around them. Tom froze. The unease he had felt all night exploded into pure fear. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Without a word, the woman began to walk, not toward him, but away, into the trees, disappearing into the fog as if she were part of it. Tom stood there, paralyzed, his breath hanging in the air like smoke. He didn't want to follow her, but something in him, some awful curiosity, urged him forward. His boots crunched on the gravel as he took a few hesitant steps after her. Wait, he called, though he wasn't sure why. His voice sounded thin and distant in the eerie quiet. The woman moved deeper into the woods, her figure fading in and out of the fog. Tom followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder, unnaturally cold. His breath came out in short, frantic bursts. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, she stopped. Tom froze as well, only a few feet behind her. The fog swirled around them, thick and oppressive. The woman's back was still turned to him, her white dress flowing in the cold wind. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence pressed down on Tom, and in that silence, he heard something. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a whisper, low and barely audible, coming from the woman. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language Tom had ever heard. It was a series of strange, guttural sounds, like something trying to speak through her. His stomach turned as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, like dozens of voices were speaking through her at once, all overlapping and jumbled. He took a step back, his mind screaming at him to get away, to run. But before he could move, the woman's head snapped around. Her face wasn't human anymore. Her eyes were black, completely black, with no whites at all. Her mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, too wide, too unnatural. Her skin was gray and stretched tight over her skull, as if her body was nothing more than a shell. And then, with a voice that was not her own, she spoke. "They are watching." Tom stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His feet slipped on the wet leaves, and he fell hard onto the ground. He scrambled backward, trying to put distance between himself and the thing that was no longer a woman. But as he tried to stand, something cold grabbed his ankle. He looked down. Hands, dozens of pale, thin hands were reaching out from the earth itself, pulling at him, clawing at his legs, his boots, dragging him toward the darkness. The whispers grew louder, deafening, as if the fog itself was alive, writhing around him, suffocating him. Tom kicked and thrashed, his mind racing with panic. He had to get away. He had to. The woman, or whatever she was suddenly standing over him, her cold, dead eyes staring down at him. Her mouth opened again, that same horrible grin splitting her face. "Join us." With a surge of adrenaline, Tom kicked free, scrambling to his feet and bolting back toward the truck. The fog seemed to chase him, the whispers growing louder, the hands reaching for him, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. He just ran. When he finally reached his truck, he threw himself into the cab and slammed the door shut. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the engine started. The fog pressed up against the windows, thick and malevolent, but Tom didn't wait to see what would happen next. He floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as he tore down the road, leaving the fog and the nightmare behind. For hours, he drove in silence, the events replaying over and over in his mind. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, pulling into the nearest truck stop, his heart still pounding in his chest. Tom never spoke of what he saw that night, but from that day on, he avoided Route 89, no matter how much longer it made his drives. Some roads, he learned, were better left forgotten. It was late, well past midnight, and Greg Hansen was the only truck on the narrow, winding back roads of West Virginia. He had taken a shortcut, something he normally avoided at night, but he was in a rush to make the delivery before morning. The roads were deserted, not a single car in sight, and the dense forest seemed to swallow up the world outside his cab. Greg had been a trucker for over 20 years, and he had seen plenty of strange things on lonely highways, odd animals, unexplainable lights, and shadows that didn't belong. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the night itself was alive, watching him, waiting. He kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to shake off the growing unease creeping over him. He passed a rusted road sign, barely visible in the moonlight. Claremont, 10 miles. 10. He had never heard of the town before, but figured it was just another small, forgotten place in the middle of nowhere. The GPS had routed him through it, so he pressed on, eager to reach the next stop and get some rest. But as he drove, the fog began to roll in. It was light at first, swirling around the trees, but soon it thickened, blanketing the road ahead. Greg slowed the truck down to a crawl, peering through the windshield as the fog swallowed the headlights. The world outside disappeared, leaving only a white wall in front of him. His heart started to race. He'd driven through fog plenty of times, but this felt unnatural, like it was pressing against the truck, trying to seep inside. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the oppressive silence. Breaker 19, a voice hissed through the static. "You out there, driver?" Greg reached for the mic, relieved to hear another person's voice. "Yeah, I'm here. You close by?" There was a pause, and then the voice came back, distorted and garbled. "Turn around. Don't go to Claremont. It ain't safe." Greg frowned, glancing at the GPS. It still showed the route going through the town. "What are you talking about? I'm almost there." The radio hissed with more static, and then the voice came through again, clearer this time but more urgent. "Don't go. Turn around now." Before Greg could respond, the radio went dead, replaced by the steady hum of static. He stared at it for a moment, unnerved. Who was that? What did they mean? His eyes flicked back to the road, and his stomach dropped. Through the fog, a figure stood in the middle of the highway. Greg slammed on the brakes, the truck lurching forward as it screeched to a halt. His heart pounded in his chest as he squinted through the windshield. The figure was just standing there, barely visible, in the dense fog. It was a woman wearing a long, old-fashioned dress that looked like something from the 1800s. Her hair hung in loose, wet strands over her face. He waited for her to move, to signal for help or walk to the side of the road, but she just stood there, completely still, her head tilted down slightly as if staring at the ground. Greg rolled down his window, the cold night air rushing in. "Hey, you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Greg's skin crawled. Something about her was deeply unsettling, but he couldn't just leave her standing there. Against his better judgment, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. The fog was thick and wet, clinging to his clothes as he approached her slowly. "Ma'am?" he called, his voice trembling. As he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The woman's skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her hands hung limply at her sides. He stopped a few feet away, and his breath catching in his throat. The air around her felt unnaturally cold, like stepping into a freezer. "Are you?" Greg began, but the words died in his throat as the woman slowly lifted her head. Her face was hollow, gaunt, with deep, dark circles under her eyes. But it was her eyes that made Greg's blood run cold. They were completely black, voids of endless darkness that seemed to swallow the light, and then she smiled. A slow, unnatural grin that stretched her lips far too wide, showing rows of sharp yellow teeth. Greg stumbled back, his heart racing in his chest. He turned to run back to the truck, but the fog had thickened even more, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. His boots slipped on the wet pavement as he hurried toward the cab, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He reached for the door, his fingers shaking, when he heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't in English, it wasn't any language Greg had ever heard, but the words slithered into his mind, twisting around his thoughts like a vice. "You are not alone." Greg whipped around, his eyes wide with terror. The woman was gone, but the fog was closing in, swirling around him like a living thing. And he saw them, figures emerging from the mist. Dozens of them. They were pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes and hollow faces. Their clothes were old, tattered, like they had been lost to time. Some looked like miners, others like farmers, all of them long dead. Their black, empty eyes stared at him, their mouths open in silent screams. Greg fumbled for the door handle, throwing himself into the cab and slamming it shut. He locked the doors, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he hit the gas. The truck lurched forward in the sorbet, tires screeching against the wet road as he sped away, leaving the figures behind in the fog. His heart pounded in his ears, and he glanced at the rearview mirror. The figures were gone. The road was clear again, the fog thinning as he put miles between him and whatever that was. He didn't stop until he reached a gas station hours later, his hands still trembling as he pulled into the lot. Inside, the clerk looked up from behind the counter as Greg stumbled in, at his face pale and covered in sweat. "You all right, buddy?" Greg shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something out there, on the road. Something wrong." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You been through Claremont?" Greg nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from the nightmarish figures. The clerk sighed, shaking his head. "You're lucky, man. Most folks who head that way don't make it back. Claremont's been a ghost town for over 100 years, burned down in 1912. They say it's cursed, that the dead don't rest easy there." Greg felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. He didn't say another word. He just paid for his gas and left. From that day on, he never took shortcuts again. He avoided that stretch of road, no matter how much time it added to his route, because some places, he learned, were better left alone. It was nearing midnight, and Eddie Macklin was dead tired. He'd been on the road for nearly 14 hours straight, driving his rig through the barren stretches of Arizona desert. The highway was empty, just a long ribbon of asphalt cutting through the flat expanse of sand and rock. His next stop wasn't for another 100 miles, but exhaustion was starting to creep up on him. His eyes were heavy, and the caffeine buzz from the gas station coffee had long worn off. Eddie checked his GPS again. The nearest town, Gray Ridge, was just about 20 miles away, a tiny dot on the map he hadn't noticed before. He decided it was time to stop for the night. Maybe grab some shut-eye, fuel up, and hit the road early in the morning. It seemed like a decent plan. As he neared the exit for Gray Ridge, the atmosphere started to change. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, and a thick, unnatural fog began to roll in, despite the desert air being bone dry. The temperature seemed to drop, too, and Eddie couldn't shake the sudden feeling that he was being watched, though he hadn't seen another car for miles. He turned off the highway and followed the narrow road toward the town. It was a strange place, to say the least. The buildings were old, like something out of the 1950s. But it wasn't just that they were old. They looked abandoned. The gas station had a rusted sign swinging in the wind, its windows boarded up. A diner's neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly green glow on the cracked pavement outside. Eddie parked his truck in front of the diner. Something about this place felt off, but his exhaustion overruled his caution. He figured he'd just grab a coffee or a quick bite and get back on the road. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the smell hit him. Stale air mixed with the faint scent of something metallic. The place was empty, save for a lone waitress standing behind the counter, staring blankly at the coffee pot. She didn't greet him when he walked in. She didn't even seem to notice him. Her eyes were distant, hollow, like she wasn't really there. Eddie cleared his throat. Hey, can I get some coffee?" The waitress slowly turned her head toward him, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they weren't right. Too large. Too black. She gave him a strange, mechanical smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Coffee's on the house," she said in a flat, monotone voice, pouring a cup without breaking eye contact. Eddie took the cup, his stomach twisting in knots. Something wasn't right with this woman. He felt it deep in his gut. He glanced around the diner, noticing for the first time how wrong everything looked. The booths were covered in dust, as if no one had sat in them for years. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at 11:43. The jukebox in the corner hummed softly, but there was no music, just a low, eerie static. He put the cup down, untouched. "Thanks, but I think I'm going to head out." he said, backing away toward the door. The waitress didn't respond. She just stood there, her dark eyes locked on him, that unnatural smile still plastered on her face. Eddie turned and bolted out the door, his heart racing. Something was seriously wrong with this place. He needed to get out of Gray Ridge, and fast. As he stepped outside, he noticed the fog had thickened, blanketing the town in a dense, impenetrable white veil. His truck, which had been parked right in front of the diner, was gone. Panic surged through him. It couldn't have just disappeared. He ran to the spot where he'd parked it, frantically looking around. No tracks, no sign of it anywhere, just the empty fog-covered streets stretching out in all directions. His head spun. How was this even possible? Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the fog. Eddie froze, his blood turning to ice. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. It was something else, something that didn't belong here. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. Through the fog, he could just make out a shape, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the middle of the street, motionless. Its eyes gleamed red in the darkness, glowing like embers. The growling sound intensified, but the figure didn't move. Eddie backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned and ran, sprinting down the street, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. The town seemed to twist and shift as he ran, the buildings warping, the streets looping back on themselves. No matter which direction he went, it was like he was running in circles. The growling followed him, closer now, like it was right behind him, chasing him through the fog. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. His legs burned, and his lungs felt like they were going to explode. But he kept running. He had to. Suddenly, the fog parted, and he found himself standing in front of the diner again. He stopped, panting, confused and terrified. How had he ended up back here? The door creaked open, and the waitress stepped out, that same blank expression on her face, her black eyes locked on him. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Behind her, more figures began to emerge from the fog. People, or at least what looked like people. Their eyes were black and hollow, just like hers. They moved slowly, unnaturally, surrounding him in a tight circle. Eddie backed up, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their dead eyes watching him, their cold, lifeless smiles spreading across their faces. "You're one of us now," the waitress whispered. Eddie felt the ground shift beneath him. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a blanket, suffocating him, pulling him down into the darkness. He struggled, but his limbs felt heavy, his mind foggy. The figures moved closer, their whispers filling his ears, their cold hands reaching out to drag him into the void. The last thing Eddie saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the diner's flickering neon sign. Gray Ridge Diner. And then there was nothing. When the sun rose the next morning, the town of Gray Ridge was as quiet as ever, its streets deserted, its buildings empty. Eddie's truck was found miles away, parked on the side of the highway, its doors locked, the engine cold. There was no sign of Eddie, no sign of anyone at all. Gray Ridge wasn't on the map anymore. Not for years, but sometimes truckers passing through that stretch of desert claimed to see it. A lonely diner lit up in the dead of night, surrounded by fog. And those who stopped there, they never come back.